Good evening, everyone. Welcome to this evening's live stream program. My name is Bob Abbey. I'm an adult services librarian for the city of Forest Grove, and would like to welcome all of our friends and followers out in Facebook and YouTube land who are joining us tonight for this presentation from Don Hann and the Oregon Chinese Diaspora Project. Don's going to be talking about some of the work that the project is doing out in the upper John Day River area around Chinese populations in the 19th century and placer gold mining. I want to remind you before I bring Don into the stream that this is an interactive program. You're more than welcome to ask questions and post your comments in the chat section on either Facebook or YouTube. And we'll get to those at the end of the evening. So please feel free to do that. I also want to let you know that this program is part of our celebration of Asian Pacific American Heritage Month all throughout the month of May. And next Tuesday night, May 18th, we are very fortunate to have with us Kawai Strong Washburn. Kawai's a novelist. His debut novel, Sharks in the Time of Saviors, has been on everybody's top 10 list, including the New York Times and Oprah. It was one of President Barack Obama's favorite books of 2020. Kawai is going to be joining us from Minneapolis to talk about that book and to talk about the relationship that the story, which is set in Hawaii, but also on the West Coast and in particular parts of the Pacific Northwest, how that connects with him. So please make sure to join us next Tuesday, May 18th at 6:30 here on Facebook and YouTube for that author event. So I want to bring on our guest tonight, Don Hann. Don has been working as an archaeologist for 30 years, most of his time spent on the Malheur National Forest. He's joining us tonight from John Day. He manages one of the largest federal cultural resource programs in Oregon, which includes over 5,000 documented archaeological and cultural sites. Don's been a proponent of public archaeology for most of his career, and he's worked with volunteers from the Forest Service's Passport in Time program since 1994. Now, his own research interests include American Indian rock art, lithic technology, and for the last 5 years, Chinese gold mining and associated sites. And Don's going to talk to us about the work that he's doing with the Oregon Chinese Diaspora Project. He's going to give us some background on that and talk about some of the work that they're doing in the upper John Day River. And I'm going to bring Don in. Hi, Don. Good evening.
Hi, Bob. Thank you.
Thank you for joining us and joining us virtually from beautiful John Day.
Mm-hmm.
How are things out there?
Oh, very nice. We're getting some good spring weather finally.
Good, good. Well, we're really happy to have you with us this evening to talk about the work you're doing with the Oregon Chinese Diaspora Project. I'm going to turn the stream over to you, and then I'll come back at the end of the program, and we can field some questions and comments and chat a little bit about some of the things that you mentioned tonight in your presentation. So I'm going to go ahead and back.
Okay. Thank you very much, Bob. And let me see. I think I'll just go ahead and start the presentation here. And I'm going to start by explaining what the Oregon Chinese Diaspora Project is. It's a group of partners that have been working together for about 5 or 6 years now.
Don, I'm sorry.
Me.
Before we go, we need you to. You're not quite sharing your screen. We're getting.
Okay.
We're getting.
Thank you for.
There we go. All right.
Okay. I'll go ahead and throw that up now. We're looking good?
Looks good.
Okay, very good. Okay, then I'll just dive in. So the Oregon Chinese Diaspora Project started in 2016, and it's a group of researchers, museums, different organizations across the state that are focusing on understanding more about the history of the Chinese Americans and their the foundation and development of the state of Oregon. I guess I won't go into. I'll wait until I show some specific examples before I list all those off. And I think maybe I'll dive right in. What is the? Okay, I just explained that. There's a group of us out in the field. So we include the U.S. Forest Service, the Malheur National Forest, in particular. The Rogue River Siskiyou is specifically joining us now with some work that's going to begin later, I think early fall this year. And then another key partner is Southern Oregon University's Laboratory of Anthropology. Chelsea Rose is the main researcher involved in that. And Chelsea and I met at a conference, Northwest Anthropological Conference, in 2015 or 16. And we were both presenting on different aspects of the Chinese diaspora. And when these big anthropology conferences happen, there's multiple things going on. We never had a chance to see each other's talk, but we kept running into people telling us we needed to talk to the other person. So eventually we arranged that, and basically we haven't stopped talking now for about 6 years and arranging different projects. So we both quickly realized that so she works in southwestern Oregon around Jacksonville. I had done work at the Jacksonville Chinatown, a really neat project there, and I worked up in the Blue Mountains, southern Blue Mountains, John Day country, and had just started working with some Chinese placer mining sites in this area. The placer mining where I worked started in the 1860s. The gold strike was 1862, but down where Chelsea worked, the gold mining started about a decade earlier. I think 1853 was generally recognized as when that started, and the Chinese started coming in there. So we both realized all gold miners were moving to different areas around the state as new gold strikes were finding, and certainly the Chinese were following that same pattern. So if we were going to understand our sites in our two parts of the state better, we really needed to connect with each other and talk to other people doing similar research to get a better handle on the complexity of the situation. We also both really appreciate public archaeology, working with volunteers, working with other groups, and partnering. So we saw a lot of opportunities to work together and started doing that right away. With those two things, we started inviting other partners in, and the thing has just grown from there. So let's see. So when we talk about the Chinese diaspora, in this case, what we're talking about is Chinese folks that came to North America starting with gold strike, or basically starting with the gold strike in California in 1849. And but before they came out here, they were people. They're all from the same part of China, Guangdong province. Really, 4 counties within Guangdong is 90-some% of the Chinese were all from this relatively limited part of China. And for a whole century before that, they were going down into Southeast Asia, to Borneo. I forget the other country I'm supposed to be thinking of, but down into Southeast Asia, and they were gold mining there for again a full century and developing sort of the business relationships and some of the physical techniques they needed that they could transfer a century later to both the west coast of North America and at about the same time down into Australia and New Zealand. So I'll begin talking about some of the other OCDP projects, the Oregon Chinese Diaspora Project undertakings that are taking place around the state, just to give an idea, an overview of the type of things that we're working on. Then I'm going to narrow down for most of the talk is going to be focusing on the work I've been doing out here, and Chelsea's and her crew have been coming out and helping us and this other group of partners since 2017. So back in Southwest Oregon, there was a aborted effort to make a railroad going down through the Siskiyou Mountains that was happening in the late 1870s, late 1880s is when most of this was taking place. And as you know, if you ever driven I-5 in the winter, once you get to the Siskiyou Mountains, even today, they're high and fairly treacherous to get through. So getting a railroad punched through there was a challenge, and they hired Chinese laborers who had by that point gained experience working on the Transcontinental Railroad, and there were companies in place, Chinese companies, to bring labor and some expertise in that, and they were working on these large tunnels, blasting their way through the mountains, starting on two different sides and aiming to meet in the middle. Unfortunately, before they met in the middle, the whole venture collapsed because it was more expensive and time-consuming. There was eventually a different route that went through, and so it was abandoned. And then almost forgotten about. But there's these series of tunnels up in the mountains in the Siskiyous, and the lower left photograph there, that's a LiDAR representation, so sort of a laser beam-based imaging technology that very accurately maps the tunnels. They got close to each other but didn't join because it was abandoned, and their camps are still up there. So Chelsea and folks from the Medford District BLM have been working up there for a number of years now, learning more about it. The first question is there even anything up there archaeologically worth investigating? That very quickly became a yes, and they've been working there ever since. Back in John Day, then, we had a fairly extensive Chinatown. As a matter of fact, the Chinese population in the 1870 census and the 1880 census was over 40% of the total population of John Day. And it was actually 40% of the total population of the county. It was a higher percentage of the population. In 1870, I think it actually was more than 50% of the population, and down to about 40 in 1880. So a really substantial number of Chinese residents at the time. The Kamwa Chung is a mercantile building. It's the one existing building still around from those days. And the photo in the background there was from around 1909. And this is a picture of the Kamwa Chung today. And it's now a Oregon State Park. It's a state heritage site. And really famous for people interested in Chinese history, because the folks that owned it ran it from before 1900 and passed away in the 1940s and early 1950s. And basically, it was a time capsule of incredible stuff, mostly from 1920 and earlier. They bought a few new things, but the store and a lot of the things in there. And one of the owners, Doc Hay, was a Chinese medicine practitioner, and he was famous in Eastern Oregon. When I first moved out here 30 years ago, there were still quite a few folks who had gone to him as children and just had high praise for him. And he did a lot of herbal remedies. And one of the largest collection of traditional Chinese herbs in the world, including China, is now housed there. And there are Chinese researchers coming over to study it. So it's a really neat state park. Let me see. There we are. Here's just a couple pictures from inside. Some of the herbs and things. There's some neat web information on this, but it's definitely worth, well, post-COVID, it'll definitely be worth coming out and taking a visit and doing the tour through the building. It is very neat. So in 2019, the Oregon Chinese Diaspora Project did ground penetrating radar. That might have been 18 actually. And in 2019, they excavated with the ground penetrating radar. We think we identified up to 7 structures that would have been part of the original Chinatown. And they did test excavations out there. SULA, Southern Oregon University's Laboratory of Anthropology, as a field school, did test excavations there in 2019 and confirmed 2 of them as buildings and fairly substantial intact buried deposits. So most people thought everything from the Chinatown would have been gone. There wouldn't have been any decent archaeology. It would have been dredged over by later gold mining. But we've really shown that there's a lot more there. So State Parks is looking at additional funding. They have some projects. They want to build a bigger and more modern museum to highlight the building here and the history. And in that process, they're going to disturb some ground, so they need archaeological work done first. So there'll probably be several years of work out in there, and we'll get a better handle on what the Chinatown looks like. There's another place further east of here called the Eldorado Ditch. It started up kind of in the Baker City area, ran for over 100 miles, and it was all made with Chinese labor and went to gold mining areas in Malheur City was the name of the now ghost town, and it was one of the last gold mining, placer mining areas tapped into in Oregon as the end of the gold rush there, and had a substantial Chinese mining population at the time too. Up by Portland, closer to Forest Grove, was the Oswego Iron Works. This is outside of Lake Oswego, and it was an effort to reduce the cost of transporting all of the iron and steel that needed to come in around the Horn by ship or overland during the early days of settlement. And there was a mountain called Iron Mountain that did have some fairly low quality ore, but they thought they'd be able to make a run for it. And they did stay in business for, I think, a couple decades. And they hired Chinese laborers fairly early on to do transporting the ore from the mines into the smelter. And then the lower right-hand picture there, all those little beehive-shaped things, those are charcoal kilns. And the Chinese were also hired to make charcoal to run the smelter. And the core of the smelter is the lower photograph there. It's still there in a small park. And there's some interpretation, but hardly any on the Chinese component. There was a fairly large Chinatown supporting all the work that was being done there at the time. And this was as early as maybe 1868, if I remember right. So we aren't doing work there. We're very intrigued about getting some more information on that. And then from the mouth of the Columbia River all the way up to the Dalles were a whole series of salmon canneries, between 30 and 40, I believe, that operated from just before the turn of the century into maybe the 1920s. And most of them, the primary labor was also Chinese labor working in the canneries. And they had Chinatown, so Astoria had a large one associated with several salmon canneries there. There's been one documented excavation at a Columbia Gorge salmon cannery in the Chinese component that was done maybe around 1990, I think. And another group of, or a bunch of archaeological material that was collected from a Chinese salmon cannery, probably, I forget the dates of that, but it never got analyzed. So we're in negotiations with Central Washington University to try to work on getting a graduate student to analyze all that material and get it properly documented and into the pool of information about the Chinese workers out here. One other site I'll talk about before I get back to the gold mining is down in far southern Oregon, southeastern Oregon, below Malheur Wildlife Refuge, is Borax Lake. It's right near the Nevada border, and they were mining borax there. And it was, again, Chinese laborers. They were living in these little sod huts. I can't quite confirm if any of those are still standing, like that picture's from 1980. I thought they were all destroyed, but more recently I got rumor one may still be standing. And that, I believe, is on Nature Conservancy land. We haven't pursued that with them yet, but that's on the list. So that was just, whoops, another picture, excuse me, of Hot Lake and kind of what the little, the processing area for the borax and the camp looked like around the turn of the century. Oh, one other component of the Oregon Chinese Diaspora Project is Chelsea. That's her third from the left there. And some other researchers have been actually working with Stanford University and some other research groups to get permission to go back to China and interview folks at some of the ancestral villages that those original Chinese immigrants to the U.S., the gold miners, came from, and to reestablish connections there. And it's exciting for a number of reasons, but the really big one is if we could find families that still had letters home from the miners describing their living conditions, how it was to be a miner at the time from their perspective. That's something we're really lacking here in the U.S. because we just don't have copies of those letters. And it certainly is possible some of that would have gotten home and maybe survive. So anyway, very neat aspect of the project that's really just in its infancy. Okay, so that's the Oregon Chinese Diaspora Project kind of writ large and the different projects we're doing. Now I'm going to focus for the rest of the talk on Chinese placer mining. So these orange blobs all over the Pacific Northwest here just are areas where placer mining took place. And the one I just highlighted with the red circle there is the large mining area that stretches about from Baker City down to John Day, almost to the Idaho border in some parts. And it's not contiguous to there, but there's a lot of placer mining deposits in those areas, gold mines. So here's a picture. I don't have any really good ones from Oregon, so I have to steal them from neighboring areas. That's probably Oregon across the river there. This is along the Snake River in Idaho. And two Chinese gentlemen working as independent. They might be partners working on one claim. They have maybe two individuals with two individual claims. But this sort of low-level mining is traditionally what is most talked about when it comes to the Chinese miners. Individuals coming out often portrayed as not having any experience mining and sort of eking out a living, often having to work, not being allowed to do their own claims. So having to rework areas that white miners had already worked over and kind of eking out a subsistence living. Some of that did take place. These guys have what's called a rocker there, which is a little device to help process the gold. It can be run by one person pretty easily. And they're out right on the edge of the river there, probably digging right next to where they're processing. And it is one way to make some money, gold mining, but is ultimately less productive. Prospectors do this sort of process, and if they find enough gold in an area, then they'll start working away from the river source and try to find kind of the heavier deposits. But then you have to bring ditches in to bring water above the mine, and it becomes a bigger operation. One more picture of Chinese miners. This is sort of a moderate size operation. You can kind of see the folks, hopefully, in your computer screen. On the left, the miners actually working down inside those pits. You can see their shovel marks in the cut bank there where they're digging down. So this is all done by shovel. And there's the linear item, the wood frame going through there is a flume, basically. It's called a sluice. And they shovel the gravel and hopefully some gold into that flume, and it gets washed downstream by the water. And then down at the bottom, there's some riffles where the gold will settle out at the bottom if they have that all set up just right, and they process and pull the gold out there. On the right-hand side are these the tailings piles, the rocks they left behind as they went through that process. They moved from right to left across the valley there doing this processing. And this is called, this is called ground sluicing. And again, one of the types of gold processing, and one that the Chinese use quite effectively out here. And this is what that looks like 100 and some years later out of the National Forest. And you have these linear rows. The sluice boxes would have been in the troughs between those rows. And this is kind of the environment we work with. Here's a slightly different type of tailings. These are much taller. They were in a very narrow part of the valley, trying to get to the gold in the alluvial deposits. and piling up these large waste piles. These would have been picked up with a boom and a big piece of canvas or something underneath to scoop up a bunch of the rocks, swing them out of the way, and drop them on these large piles. Chinese walls is a term you hear a bit in Oregon, well, all over the American West, for these types of tailings piles that are carefully stacked like this. The common story told now is, the Chinese were very meticulous people, and so they made these very neatly stacked walls, whereas the white miners just kind of threw their rock willy-nilly. So if you find these type of walls, you're in a Chinese mining site. But it's not quite that straightforward. Really, we find these where there's a narrow constriction. It's a narrow valley they're working in, and they have to be careful not to control where the rocks go, so they can still run their flumes through it. And both white and Chinese miners would do this. But anyway, just give you an idea of what some of those features look like out of the ground. So very quickly, I've been out here for 30 years, but I only started looking at the Chinese mining stuff seriously about 6 years ago. And it was based on some large landscape scale thinning projects the Forest Service is doing now to try to reduce the impacts of these large mega wildfires we've been having, getting progressively worse over the last several decades. And so the idea is to thin out a lot of these smaller trees that have been allowed to grow in when we've been successfully suppressing fires for 100 years. Now we want to try to figure out how to get fire back in the landscape again, so that when fires go through, they don't burn as hot. They'll be more frequent, but smaller and more controllable. So we had about 100,000 acres. My team and I was asked to clear, to go through, identify all the important archaeological sites, and make sure we don't damage them when we do these processes. And we got out there, we recognized there was a lot of mining that took place out there, and we were looking for a way to narrow down the area rather than going out and trying to survey 100,000 acres. So there's a technology called LiDAR that is basically flying over a landscape with a laser beam, and it allows you to make a virtual map of the forest and the forest floor, accurate down to about 10 inches or even a little shorter than that. And using the wonders of modern technology, you can virtually remove all the vegetation and just get this map of what they call a bare earth map of the landscape. So this is an area on the Middle Fork of the John Day that actually has a lot of mining in it. All we see is trees. And then this is digitally processed bare earth model, and where all these little arrows are pointing out, those are all mining areas, most of which were associated, in this case, with the Chinese. Using LiDAR, we narrowed down the 100,000 acres to about 10,000 acres in multiple locations of where the gold mining took place, where we could focus our efforts. So here's an example of a specific feature. This is a dam, which would have had a big reservoir behind it, that was identified in LiDAR. And this is what it looks like out of the ground. This is a earthen dam, all made by a tamped earth construction technique that was used in China, not frequently used in the Northwest here by Euro-American miners. So we're quite certain, and a bunch of other evidence, that this was done by Chinese miners. So then we started, we got out, we now knew where to look. We did our preliminary look in 2016 after we did the LiDAR, and we were starting to find clusters of Chinese artifacts and a lot of mined area that did not look like it had been reworked. And we started to realize a lot of this was probably actually Chinese. And so in 2017, Chelsea and her crew from Southern Oregon came out and did our first kind of preliminary look. And it was, like I said, a buck rock tunnel. The first thing you do is, once we peek under the ground, is there even anything worth looking at in these locations? And we did cut a little segment of one of these earthen dams out and confirmed that it was that tamped earth construction technique, which demonstrated it was probably Chinese. And then we also went to a small cabin footprint where a cabin was, where we'd found a couple pieces of Chinese ceramics on the surface and a little bit of metal scattered around. There wasn't all that much there. But once we put some holes in the ground, we did controlled excavations, we ended up with thousands of artifacts, a lot of stuff confirming it was Chinese, and clearly a good reason to keep looking. So in 2008, we geared it up quite a bit, did a longer project, and tied in a lot of volunteers from the Forest Service's Passport in Times program, which is a National Forest Service Heritage volunteer program. It's pretty neat. And we had, I forget, 20-some volunteers from Passport in Time, and Chelsea and her crew, some folks from the Oregon Archaeological Society, based out of Portland, but a statewide group of avocationalists came out to help. And we went to 4 different mining camps and focused on a range of different habitation sites to see what was there. And again, we were just very impressed by the amount of stuff we found. The pile of rocks that I'm pointing at here on one of our preliminary tours as we're getting ready to do the work, it was kind of at the head of where a cabin was, and in a Euro-American cabin would be where a fireplace and chimney is, but they don't collapse like those things do. They didn't look right, I'll put it that way. This weird pile of rocks. So this one had been heavily hit by looters, unfortunately, and we didn't excavate it. But we excavated at another site, and we confirmed that it was used for cooking, and we think it was set up as like a wok stove, which is a traditional type of stove used in China. To our knowledge, it's the first thing that's kind of confirmed that process here in the States, although it does just make a lot of sense. And that's one of the things that we're still working on the analysis on. What are the bold fragments we found, etc. Whoops, there we go. So in 2019, one of the other things we tested in 2018, we kind of jumped 40 miles, 30 miles down the river to another location where there were a lot of Chinese miners, tested a site that didn't look promising on the surface, found a lot of material, and the metal detectors didn't particularly went nuts in one section. And on the left-hand side of the picture here are a bunch of these metal, kind of heavy metal fragments. They're shovels, cast iron and steel shovels, axe bits, bigger pieces of metal that had all been broken and then clustered together in one place. So we hypothesized that they were going to have a blacksmith shop. That's the sort of behavior the blacksmith would do. And we found a lot of evidence earlier that there was blacksmithing and metalworking taking place to support the mining there. The Chinese were doing their own work. And so we excavated that the following year. It's in 2019, and we hit a lot of charcoal. We hit a lot of slag from blacksmithing. There's slag is kind of waste metal that comes off when you're blacksmithing. There's a different type of slag that comes off when you're actually smelting, when you're heating the metal hard enough to actually melt it and recast it into something. We didn't really expect to see that, but we did find that kind of slag, so we're pretty sure they were actually remelting and repairing some of this stuff here. So fairly sophisticated blacksmithing work, and that we just, again, starting to analyze and hope to get more information on that. That's the first Chinese blacksmithing site that's been excavated in the state of Oregon. There was another one in a small ghost town of Warren, Idaho, that was done by a graduate student, 10 plus years ago now, I believe. That's excellent. She did wonderful work on that. And so that gives us something to compare this site with and see the differences. A blacksmith out at the mines as opposed to one working in the town. And up in the upper right corner, that is the remains of what's called a 5-piece gold pan. And it's a type of gold pan that was constructed using sheet metal and heavy wire. And a tinsmith could do this, a metal worker that didn't require all the blacksmithing equipment. And it could be made by folks in a mining town or out on a mining camp. And it's a real distinctive shape. Once you recognize what it is, these little pieces of metal that are left over from it, it's a real easy thing to recognize. We know most of them are probably before 1890 or so, which is when the patents came out for making one-piece gold pans that are pressed out of a single sheet of metal, so they hold up better, they're stronger, and those kind of just took over the market real quickly. So they're a neat indicator of age. We don't see that recognized in any of the historical archaeological literature, so it's another thing that we've learned. I probably saw all kinds of them for 30 years here, but until we recognized what it was, I never knew, and now I see them on a somewhat regular basis, and it tells me that kind of mining was going on. So based on all that LiDAR, the map I show on the left here is a 1,200 acre or so complex of placer mines. There are 7 different discrete areas where mining took place. We named the complexes based on where the water sources and the ditch network derived from. So this complex 5 here is the largest of them. It's a lot of area. And we now have special mapping on this. We have this all documented to protect while we do the thinning projects in the future. Oh, good. I do have the Wok Stove here. This is the Wok Stove after we excavated it. We placed the one rock on the top was actually flipped down over the in front of it. But we do think that that was placed on top. It has kind of a curve in the back. And when they had a fire in the back of that, they would have set that on there as it makes a nice little hole for placing a wok on and cooking. And this is a wok oven from in China, an older one, but they're still used contemporarily. Most have been replaced by gas and electric, like everything else. But here's a wood-fired one from out in a village, and that was the common what it would have been at home for the Chinese miners back in the 19th century. What was I going to talk about? That. Oh, okay. So this, I'm just going to look at some of the key artifacts we find now at the site to tell us we're at a Chinese site. So there's a Chinese coin with a square hole in the middle there. There are some, the central pictures. I don't know if you can see my cursor, but in the center here is some metal from Chinese opium containers. So opium was legal back in those days, and some of the Chinese did use it for medicinal and recreational reasons and imported it in here. And they have these special stamps that say what town they came from in China. And this one at the bottom has a part of an orange paper label. That's been buried in the ground for over 120 years on the forest and still had the paper label intact, which really surprised me. In the lower right-hand corner is the bottom of a tin that held vegetable oils. The Chinese imported their own vegetable oil. They didn't want to cook with lard and some of the other things that was more commonly available here. So they were importing these about 2-gallon containers of vegetable oil, and they had a large fill hole, and it was then capped with a solder and a metal square like that, and it's very distinctive. It's the only thing like it out there, so we know that's Chinese. Let's see, hobnailed rubber boots. So rubber boots, anybody working in a placer mine, regardless of their ethnicity, liked rubber boots. And they were very readily available in the U.S. and either imported by Chinese merchants and sold in Chinese stores, or they could have bought them from white merchants in town. But these boots, a lot of the ones we find at the Chinese sites, have little nails that have been put on the bottom of them. And these were done after the fact, hobnailing, to give a little more grip. And where we find these tends to be associated with Chinese sites. We think the Chinese were specifically doing that, and the white miners weren't. So again, if we find these old boots out there, and it's amazing how those old boots, 100 to 120 years old, have held out. That tells me we have not had a forest fire in that amount of time, because that rubber would disappear. And anyway, a neat indicator. Chinese, this is some more evidence of their metalworking. So there is a type of placer mining called hydraulic mining, which was using these large purchased nozzles. Imagine a 12 to 20 foot long giant garden nozzle to concentrate water, and they could literally blast away hillsides. And then you used metal piping to bring the water down from a reservoir down to the site to build pressure. The metal pipe is called penstock. And in this case, probably Chinese miners, because we don't have any evidence that the whites were doing it. We only find this at a few Chinese sites now. They made their own nozzles. It would have reduced the cost. They wouldn't have had to buy them, and they were making them out of this sheet metal, this penstock and then riveting it together. So on the narrower side on the right, they have the out where the water would have shot out is reinforced by about a 3 or 4 inch piece of pipe. And on the right-hand side, it would have been sewn into canvas hose. It wouldn't have built up all the pressure that the manufacturer, the expensive hydraulic giants and stuff would have had, but it's sort of a step between just using your shovels and that process. And it does seem to be something the Chinese were using and had metal workers that could do it. I'm holding a little piece of a railroad rail. That really confused us when we excavated it in 2014, because it was up at a Chinese mining site. Everything looked older, I mean, from the 1880s to 90s. Then we have this thing, and we know there was railroad logging very nearby, but not until after 1910. And so, how did that get up here? What's the story? What we think was going on now is that this was brought in by the Chinese miners, had nothing to do with the railroad that was here. And folks working on the Transcontinental Railroad, or maybe the railroad, the Oregon and California one, that Chelsea and team on the BLM land down outside of Medford were working on, or outside of Jacksonville. Folks working there were cutting off little pieces of the rail, and we think this was a portable anvil to be used for metalworking. And then the picture of the pick there is a fairly straightforward pick, but we find a lot of broken off tangs. The tips of the pick were straightened up after they were broken and turned into cold chisels. And we see that at a lot of the sites. So they're reworking a lot of metal. Here's some more evidence of reworking some of the cans they brought in. There's a shovel that was flattened, and then this metal circle cut out. About the size of a stove top. So I don't know if that was to be a metal plate to go over a stove. The cast iron one broke and they were using it. We're not sure. What we found was the back, what was left after they removed something. A little bit on some of the finding the historic record we've been doing to try to understand. Now that we understand, boy, there was a lot more Chinese gold mining happening on the forest than we thought. We started looking at the census information. And that's where we found those numbers I gave at the very beginning about how many Chinese were living in John Day. It turns out that in Grant County in 1870 and 1880, about 80% of the miners were actually Chinese, and only about 20% were Euro-Americans. And so they were dominating placer mining in particular in those 2 decades, and probably a little bit on either side of that. They were also identifying a lot of Chinese companies. It wasn't just individual miners coming out. It was groups of Chinese working together in a form of partnership called Kung Si. That's a whole other talk that I won't get into here, but it's the way they organized themselves back in Borneo and back in China. And it was a partnership where every member of the partnership got a percentage. They didn't get a wage. They got a percentage of the profits based on their contribution to the partnership. And that contribution could be capital, but it could be equipment, and it could be knowledge, and it could be labor. And it was split up. And anyway, we have the names of these various companies. What had happened is in 1880, the census taker got curious about who these folks were. Apparently had someone who could translate, or even more rarely, actually could speak Chinese. Anyway, he learned, or maybe talked to a Chinese person who was speaking English. Anyway, that these were mining companies. He named the company and how many people were working for them. So kind of a neat record of that happening here. We also have a handful of the actual lease agreements or sales of the placer mines, of the mine itself, to Chinese companies. And they're always out here sold to a Chinese company. And in 2 cases are referred to as partnerships or co-partnerships. So implying, it really was this Kung Si, this type of organization that we saw back in China. And this happened from almost the beginning. Out here again, 1862 was the gold strike. By 1866, we have named Chinese gold companies working out there, going almost to the turn of the century. And we actually have some newspaper accounts about a Chinese mining operation still, I think, 1912, still working out. And in this case, we have the documents signed in Chinese script. And I did get these folks to some folks who can read. Modern Chinese script is different than the traditional Chinese script, so you have to hunt someone down who can actually read that old stuff and confirm that, sure enough, Ah Heng is the right name. That's what that basically says in Chinese. Let's see here. So stepping into 2021. So 2020, like many of us, Southern Oregon University was going to be back on the Malheur for their last year up here of this current project. We've found enough stuff now. We have to get the analysis done and the formal reports written up, as well as presenting, to the public our findings. And so we need to take a step back now. It turns out there's enough stuff out there, and there's aspects of how we're rewriting the history of the Chinese in Oregon that has turned out to be fairly important. So we need to get it all written down and think carefully about our next steps moving forward. We do think there will be next steps moving forward on the Malheur, but we're going to take a break right now. And the bigger group's going to be working in different parts of the state on different projects. So 2020, we had to cancel everything. 2021, so the last week in June, first week of July, 2 weeks over that period, we're going to have a 1 week passport in time project. We're going to have about 16 people out working with us. We're going to focus on using metal detectors to do some preliminary work at a few locations. And then we have a graduate student that is from University of Idaho. It's someone who's worked with us for a number of years now. And she is going to do some testing at a couple other habitation sites for her thesis work. And working with half the volunteers, I'll be working with the other half in the metal detecting. And then the following week, Chelsea and her team from Sula will come in. We'll do a little overlap so she can do some presentations to the folks from Sula. And then because it's their last year, we decided not to overlap with the volunteers and allow Chelsea and her team to really focus on getting all the loose ends done. We're going to do at least 2 more Chinese sites. And just in keeping in the Asian American Pacific Islander Heritage Month, we're going to do our first excavation at a Japanese railroad camp also. And we found that Japanese railroad construction workers came in around 1910 and stayed until Pearl Harbor, and that story, and where so many were forced to leave their jobs and their livelihoods. And study that camp and see, again, this is our preliminary thing. Is there anything worth pursuing there? We'll see what happens. Chelsea, then in the fall, in partnership with the Rogue River Siskiyou National Forest, will be revisiting the Jin Lin placer mine, which is in this realm a fairly famous mine. Jin Lin was a very good businessman and a very good miner, and he actually was making enough money. He invested in the form of expensive high mining equipment very well for himself. He hired Chinese and white laborers in different jobs. He made sure to keep good connections with local businesses, and it's a very compelling story. Jeff Lalande in the 1980s did his graduate work on this stuff, and then he was the forest archaeologist on the Rogue River Siskiyou at the time. Did some neat projects, has a neat interpretive trail down there. That sort of over the years kind of got into disrepair, as can happen. His attention was not paid. So they're going to have Chelsea go do some additional testing and more information. We're going to take all the new information about the Chinese and apply it there. But it's a neat, different kind of site because it was a very large scale project compared to, or a mining operation compared to what we see up here. So thank you. I covered a lot of ground, hopefully somewhat coherently for you. And on this slide, I have some other sources of information you can look at. And other thing I should mention, the Oregon Historical Quarterly, published by the Oregon Historical Society, their winter edition 2021 is specific on the Chinese diaspora, or Asian diaspora, actually. I think there's some Japanese articles in there, if I remember right. I have an article, Chelsea has an article, Katie Withy, who works with me on the Malheur here, has an article in there. I believe Tatiana does. Anyway, a lot of the folks working on this have articles in that and some other stuff. and it should be a very good journal. So, Bob, I'm ready for questions if that's where we're going to go. And I hear nothing.
You know, I've been doing this so long and I still forget to unmute my mic.
Makes me feel better.
Oh man. Thank you, Don. I jotted down some questions, and we do have some questions from the folks who are watching. One of the questions that I had, and somebody raised it in the chat, is just about the nature of placer mining. Can you talk a little bit about what that is? My understanding is that I mean, there are several different types of placer mining, but that water is involved. Can you kind of walk us through what placer mining is?
Yes, I can. Thank you. That was, yeah. In condensing stuff, that was a bit of an oversight. Excuse me. So first, with gold mining, there's sort of two primary types of gold mining. There's placer mining and there's hard rock mining or quartz mining. So when you think about tunnels and shafts and mines and picks, all that kind of stuff, that's hard rock mining. You're getting the ore, you're pulling it out, and then you have to grind the ore down and smelt it in a smelter and do that process. And the initial mining in the area is usually placer mining, and that's for free gold. That's for gold that usually through alluvial processes, so getting caught up in ancient rivers. The quartz veins that would have had the gold embedded in them get ground down, and the gold ends up getting free and can be in fine dust to large nuggets. And so those will be in ancient gravel bars, not necessarily gravel bars on modern rivers. So you got to keep that in mind. They can be upslope quite a ways from a river, and even in an area that doesn't look like a river now. And but they are in some form of gravel bar. You find rounded material with it from being tumbled down, rounded rocks. So then there's a number of different ways in placer mining to get that gold. So the first technique is kind of everyone's picture of a prospector, right? An old guy with a big beard and a burro, and he's got his gold pan and his pick and a shovel, and he walks funny, and he goes out there, and they'll actually dig on the side of the stream and then pan some of that material with the gold pan, so they're sloshing that around. Gold being heavier stays settled at the bottom, and if you get your technique down, you can wash all the other stuff out of the way and just leave the gold. The trouble is, it's a pretty slow process, but that's your initial process. It's the easiest thing to bring out to discover if there's gold in the area. The next process would be using those rockers. So that one of the early pictures I showed of the Chinese guys out on the Snake River there was using the rocker. And that's just a one-person device that is sort of like a condensed sluice box that has little riffles in the bottom, and then you wash water over it, and the gold will settle down on the riffles and capture there. One person can run that, and they can process around, I think, 15 times as much material in a day using that compared to gold. So if you have if you want to understand, if you want to make a little more money, you're going to use that process. It's also pretty portable. One or two people can use that. By that point, you may or may not, if you're right by a river like that, you wouldn't necessarily need to put a ditch in. Often by that point, you want to get a little ditch coming off the river and bring the water closer to you. So you get some infrastructure. And a group of miners might start working together to put that ditch. Then the next step is the ground sluicing, and that's using a sluice box of some sort. And you're using your rock, you went, wow, there's enough gold here. We need to get more material out of the way and make more money faster. So then you put a more substantial ditch in from a higher point and rise it higher above your mine area. You're making a strategic guess. How far up the slope do I need to go to put that ditch in? And if you go too low, you have to put another ditch in. So but if you go, the higher you go, the further upstream you have to go, and the longer it is. And then you wash it through these, dig it out, throw it into this channel, and wash it through these sluice boxes. And then there's the hydraulic mining, and that's using those big hoses I was describing. That still uses sluices at the end of the process. It's a way to wash that stuff down, much higher volume, much faster. But cost more money and a bigger infrastructure. And then ultimately was the dredges, these giant dredges. And there is one, interestingly, that survived. They just walked away from it 1953, if I remember right, up in Sumter, Oregon, just to my north here. It too is managed by the state park. It's about 3 stories tall. It's worth visiting. And unfortunately for people studying the history of placer mining, the archaeology of it, those things often ate up most of the earlier history by dredging over that earlier work. And that's what happened in the John Day Valley, right there by the John Day Chinatown. We don't exactly know how the Chinese were mining there because I haven't found any pocket of it that was left. It makes the stuff up on the National Forest a little upstream and up into steeper ground kind of more valuable from this perspective because you couldn't set a dredge in those areas. So more of those are intact. Mm-hmm. There's a long answer to your short question.
Well, that's very helpful. I mean, I think your comment about the sort of stereotypical image of a miner, right, with the gold pan and that seems like a fairly straightforward way. I mean, I've tried that. It's hard. It's hard work. Yeah. But that's really helpful to kind of give some sense of what the different options were, and that particular type of mining seemed to be the preferred way for a variety of reasons. One of which you point out is that it just required less infrastructure. It was more portable, and also it sounds like this is a fairly solitary endeavor, right? You're not maybe sharing the stream with a lot of other people, so there's that kind of portability about all of that. Is that right?
No, I think actually it's not right, and it's not right because there usually were multiple groups. There were a lot of people mining at a given time, and the miners self-regulated, making their own rules. And each mining district had these sets of rules, and they established the size of a given claim. So you were restricted in the size of a claim you could have to allow for other miners. So it was more of the prospecting part can be quite solitary as you're trying to find where the gold is. Once you find it, apparently no one kept that very quiet. Then a lot of people come flooding in, particularly if there's much of a strike, and then this whole infrastructure. And it becomes, little towns get developed, saloons come in, supplies are brought in, bizarrely social.
Interesting, yeah, and again, it does seem like a fairly solitary. The image that we have is that it's a fairly solitary, fairly lonely endeavor. But it's interesting that doesn't turn out to be the case. One of the questions, kind of related to that, is how were these mining locations identified as being promising for prospecting? And then sort of a follow-up is, was there any record of how much gold was actually found in these different locations?
It looks like trial and error was the major process folks used. There are places where there are remnants of those initial stages of mining, the prospecting, little test pits that were dug out 3 feet in diameter, not only a couple feet deep, they may have been a little bit deeper before. And maybe evidence where they were processing with a rocker on the edge, so the rocks tossed off to the side. Very small operations. In areas now, for a number of reasons, we know there was no chance of ever finding gold. But once they got into a given area, prospectors were heading up every little stream and trying to find some evidence of the gold. So in this case, in John Day, so the strikes in the Jacksonville area, southwestern Oregon, are by people that study mining history kind of considered the tail end of the California gold rush. So people spread out from Sumter's Mills back in the day and ended up going to different drainages and testing it, and then groups would move into the different parts of the Sierras, and this was kind of the last part of that process in the 1850s and got up there. Then people were actually, the people that discovered gold in John Day were heading to a new gold strike in Idaho. And just as they're passing through, I think they're literally, every stream they find, they're digging up gravel and panning it. And sure enough, in Canyon City, a couple miles south of John Day on Canyon Creek. We're kind of redundant on our names here. It's below Canyon Mountain. Was the gold strike, and there were parties of miners coming, usually attributed to coming from California. It might have come up this early trail called the Wairika Trail from California. Some of them might have actually been coming from Jacksonville and then tied into that trail because they would have went to where basically where Klamath Falls is now, and then come up that trail. And then others coming from Portland, coming down and coming into the John Day Valley. They both kind of went to the same area, and then would travel east along the John Day Valley to get to Boise Basin. And the initial gold strike looks like it was Oregonians from the Portland area. This Oregon California thing has been going on for a long time. Oregonians from the Portland area found some gold. One guy found it, but the guys he was traveling with said, "Well, that's cute, but the big strike's this one. We want to go to this one." So they all got on their horses and rode to I can't remember, I think it was Snake River, but I forget exactly where. And they just go over a hill, and it's just claimed up from end to end. It's just this giant group of people. They realized, wow, we got here too late. So then they turned around and hard rode back and got here, and there were some folks here, Californians, darn it, who had discovered gold and were starting to work on setting up the mining regulations. They told them their story. Apparently, there was evidence they were there. They bought their story, and so they were brought into the fold, and that was the initial mining situation here. So that covered the how do you find it, and then amount of gold. There was a government bureaucracy, believe it or not, a minerals department that did annual reports on the amount of mineral wealth coming out of the United States. And they in theory, all the gold and other minerals went to SA offices and then went to mint or smelters, or there was a process where they could go to these places and get the amount of gold. In reality, people didn't always follow that process, and but there are estimates. I think around $21 million out of the John Day area of the dollars in those days, which would be a lot more now. I forget what it is, but considerable mineral wealth out of this one. I don't know the numbers for the other mining areas here, but there are some estimated figures.
Interesting. One thing that struck me as you were showing the pictures of all of those different artifacts, and you'd mentioned there was one site that looked like it had been looted, and I'm wondering how much human contact do you find, in terms of these artifacts? I mean, I know it's a fairly remote area, so it's not like people are just kind of walking by, but it's amazing that you are finding so much stuff, and I'm just wondering how much human interaction is happening there.
Yeah, well, you're right. We're a low population in general. We do have a lot of people come out. Around 40,000 hunters over different hunting seasons through a season, so that increases many times the actual population. I think that's a correct number. And then there are, contemporary gold miners. The Malheur has right around 100 claims, a little over 100 claims right now. Ours are pretty small operations. You get up into the Wallowa-Whitman National Forest, up closer to Baker City, and I think they have over 600 claims, and some of those are small commercial operations. So there are still people involved with that come out seasonally to do mining. So there's people in the woods doing different things. But you're right, it's nothing like the Mount Hood National Forest and the amount of visitation they would get being right next to Portland.
Right, and it does seem like whatever human visitation is there is leaving that stuff alone, right? They're not, or do you know? I mean, are people taking things?
No, people are taking things. I'm quite certain. It's somewhat human nature to try to argue against it, but we have one law enforcement officer for 1.7 million acres, and he's shared with other, so don't tell anybody, but you're probably going to get away with it if you go grab a bottle and run, right? So we have to use public education to try to get folks not to do that, because all the information that Chelsea and I and others, Katie and folks, have been able to pull together is from what's left out there yet. But it has definitely been impacted by later visitation. Now, that said, it's still not at the scale of other places I've worked, where there's much more sort of organized looting going on. Sadly, there's a kind of bizarre tie between meth production and stealing artifacts from National Forest grounds, because if you want to make some capital maybe to start your meth lab, you'll go out and try to get artifacts. So anyway, it gets to be an interesting part of my job. Does get to be involving with our law enforcement officers, with Oregon State Police on those issues. Sadly, most of our visitors, of course, don't do anything like that. Recognize history is important, or just wouldn't think of doing it. But unfortunately, there's a small number, and it is a constant issue for us.
Yeah, I mean, it's amazing the kinds of things that you found. And as you were talking, I mean, one of the things that I was waiting for, and you actually addressed it, was the habitation artifacts. That they're not just mining artifacts, but there are things that document the daily lives of the folks who were there, which I think is pretty remarkable. Is that pretty typical for? I mean, do you typically find those kinds of habitation artifacts along with this sort of economic activity?
Well, it kind of depends on the length of time of the activity, but the larger areas that showed up so nicely in the LiDAR, where they're spending, at least a full mining season. You can't do placer mining year round. You can't do it in the winter, and you can't do it when it gets too dry out here. So you have a 4-month window maybe, and most people were getting out when it was pretty cold. So you needed some sort of shelter. Although a lot of people, we usually find like one central cabin, probably not enough to house everybody, and other folks are probably living in tents or brush shelters on the edges. But there are these central areas. They're very, if you look at the one mining complex I showed a map of was about 1,200 acres. And in that area, we have found 5 clearly mining associated habitation sites, 3 of which we have confirmed are Chinese. The other 2 may or may not be. We're not sure yet. Haven't found Chinese artifacts. So they're a small footprint within this larger footprint. But definitely, if they're spending time there, you have to eat. And these Chinese mining companies, part of the way they were making a profit is, they were cooking together. They were doing mass. They were buying their own supplies, buying in bulk, if you will, and all that. So they have this real centralized feel, which is kind of unique compared to cabins by white miners that they were just out there. They were still out there seasonally, but they would more frequently go back to the town probably and stock up and come back. A little bit different operation.
So another issue that I thought about as you were talking is that the dates of much of this activity, particularly when you were talking about the businesses, coincide with a period in American history when Chinese immigration was restricted, and particularly in the early 1880s, the Chinese Exclusion Act, and then we had the Hell's Canyon Massacre in 1887, and there was the Rock Springs Massacre in Wyoming in 1885. Is there any record of any sort of anti-Chinese activity in that part of Oregon during that time?
Nothing of the scales of the 2 incidents you're talking about. There are unconfirmed rumors that we think are not true, actually, of it's called the Lily White Mine. That was north of us a little bit, and it would have been a hard rock mine. And the story is that they had Chinese laborers working inside the tunnel, and the last shift when they decided to close it down, rather than paying them, they just blasted the tunnel shut and killed everybody. Um, a compelling and frightening story with absolutely no evidence that actually took place. And then people have kind of built on that story to say that that happened quite frequently. And there's no evidence of that. I'm not at all trying to suggest there wasn't a lot of racism and it wasn't a hard, life out here. There were aspects of that, but in the John Day area, I would expand this to northeastern Oregon in general. The Chinese mining companies were often leasing land from the ranchers to do their work, or buying or leasing claims from white miners when they no longer found them profitable. So there was an economic incentive to work with the Chinese. And I think, they may have grumbled about how people looked and how they acted funny or whatever. And in the newspaper accounts, you can find some pretty, horrific statements, sadly. But you also then find these accounts of people being so impressed with the organization of the Chinese, how effective they were at the mining, or showing off about the fact, so one of these claims, they got $6,000 for the Chinese to get mining rights on this small section of their ranch. And that's about $100,000 today. So, they were not mad at the Chinese. They were pretty impressed these guys were going to pay them that much money and then could bring in these hundreds of people to work the site, had the windlasses and different types of equipment, the skill to bring the water in, to run the equipment, all this. It was, they were not degrading them in that particular article. So it depends. There was Long An and Ing He, who had the Kamwa Chung. At one point, they were raided after opium was made illegal in 1909. They were raided there and arrested. Long An was Doc Hay's partner in the business, but he won his court case. The jury would not convict here because they had a good working relationship with folks. So it was some of both, but no confirmed massacre we know of. Individual incidents at a relatively small scale that everyone was doing to everybody. So Chinese against Chinese, white against white, white against Chinese, Chinese against white. But pretty small number of those things. They were dealt with pretty harshly back in the days.
I want to wrap up by having you just talk a little bit about what you would like folks to know about the Chinese activity in Oregon that we don't know now. What would be an important takeaway from the work that you're doing and the discoveries that you're making that help kind of give us a different sense of the contribution that Chinese immigrants made to the state?
Yeah. Okay. No, good. I appreciate that. I think the biggest thing to just summarize, there's a lot of specifics to back this up. That would be different talks, but is just the scale. Again, 40% of the population in Grant County for 2 decades, 80% of the actual mining taking place, at least the miners. So approximately the amount of the mining, the economic engine that was, and a lot of that money did go back to China, but a lot of it stayed here to buy supplies, to invest in businesses, to do other things. The Chinese were part of the creation of the modern state of Oregon to a much greater extent than we usually learn in our history. We do hear that there was a Chinese component here. But I lived out here for 30 years, or almost 30 years, 25 years, I guess, before I started to understand the scale. I knew the Kamwa Chung building was here, and there was a Chinatown, but I assumed it was overall a relatively small percentage of the population. And that's kind of the way the story is told. We've noticed in looking at we, in this case being primarily Chelsea and I, looking at some research we've done together, that the story really changed between how the Chinese were described before 1900 and right around 1900, a little bit later. You went from hearing stories about these, being impressed by the scale of the work they're doing and how hardworking people were and organized and how they were businesses going together. And then suddenly around 1900, you start hearing stories. The Chinese were, the poor, starving individuals pushed out of China, eking out a living, pawing through the remains of white miners' tailings. They were so desperate that the little bit of gold they discovered, they're portrayed as individual miners, not even really miners, peasants starving and coming out and just eking out this little living. What we've learned is how sophisticated they were, how they've been doing it for 100 years before they ever came to North America and Southeast Asia. So their processes and the techniques were all in place. And so they really had a foot up on the white placer miners here. Mm-hmm. And that's just the placer mining. There's other components, how involved they were, hop farming, the so-called market gardens, producing vegetables for the urban areas, for Portland, for Salem, for places like that. It was a lot bigger component of the development of the state. And unfortunately, because of the laws you mentioned, it was hard for them to bring families here. It was hard for them to own land. So they all, being spread across the state in various components of different occupations, they ended up having to centralize in urban areas primarily for economic reasons. And in there, the jobs didn't come up often either. So they ended up being a smaller percentage of the population by 1900 or later than they were in that earlier part. So I think it's a really important story to tell, particularly given some of the cultural and political chaos around Asian Americans that have been going on for the last few years, to re-demonstrate or to show it's not inventing history. The invented history is that they got kind of erased from our history. The real history is that they were parcel of it all along. And to talk about that, and that was not our intent when we started this. It just looking at the facts is where the facts led us. Mm-hmm. So I think that's the news.
Well, we appreciate the work that you're doing and that Oregon Chinese Diaspora Project is doing to help flesh out that history and to remind us of what an important contribution Chinese immigrants made to the state's history. And I hope it's the beginning of a shift in our understanding about that contribution. So I thank you so much for joining us tonight and talking about this really fascinating work in a part of the state that I think probably not a lot of folks get an opportunity to visit. And I think this really helped certainly provide a real sense of place about that and to give it more of a definition, and particularly around the Chinese contribution with placer mining. So Don, thank you so much for joining us tonight. And again, you said that the winter 2021 issue of the OHQ, Oregon Historical Quarterly, will have an article by you and by Chelsea. So that will definitely check that out. And we talked at the beginning before we went on. OCDP doesn't have a website or a web presence as of yet, but this is something that's in the future, correct?
Right, we're working on that. Yes.
All right, great.
There is there's a listserv that we do share some information on that folks, if they can contact me, and I'm one of the co-managers of the listserv, but we don't have a good web presence yet. We're using other things. Another really neat source is that Explore APA Heritage website that I had on my slides at the end. That's where I think you were going to put that in the chat for folks to look at.
Yeah.
And that has a lot of sites in Oregon that are worth visiting and has some more information about that.
Okay, great. Well, Don, thank you again so much for joining us from John Day. And we will stay in touch, and hopefully we can touch base as the project moves forward.
Well, thank you, Bob. I really appreciate the opportunity to reach out and talk to folks. So.
All right. And everybody, as a reminder, next Tuesday, we'll be back here again to chat with Kawai Strong Washburn, author of Sharks in the Time of Saviors, about his debut novel. So please join us at 6:30, either on Facebook or YouTube. And until then, everybody have a great week, and we'll see you all next week. Bye-bye.